All right. All right. So let's begin with our lightning round talks. I'd like to first, go to, we have our first presenter, doctor, recently completed her dissertation. Congratulations, Dr. Jackie Rangel, please. And I'm gonna make you co-host, and so you can share, actually.
Okay, shall I begin now?
Yes, you're all set to begin.
Okay, I will share my screen. Can everyone see that? Oops, let's see.
Yes, we're all
Okay,
set. We can see that. Thank you.
you're welcome. Okay, hello, my name is Jackie Rangel. This study is aimed to understand the role of mentorship for Latinas who obtain PhDs while negotiating their cultural or gender identities. This work is dedicated to my Indigenous ancestors. My father was born in Seguin, Texas. As a child, he picked cotton alongside his 7 siblings. My mother was also born in Texas. As a child, she missed many months of school because she and her 4 brothers would be with their parents shear sheeping across the northwestern part of the United States. My identity is central to this research. I'm grounding my positionality as a first-generation Latina scholar within the data. I want to make a difference for Latinas in the deficit narrative we face in doctoral programs and in educational systems. In the United States, Latinas are underrepresented in obtaining PhDs. This may be due to patriarchal academic institutions and approaches that have historically devalued the cultural experiences and identities of marginalized populations, including Latinas. The purpose of this study stems from the problems in society and how the participants navigated their cultural and gender identities in academia. There was also a twofold purpose. First, to elevate the voices of the Latinas, and second, to understand the cultural and gender identity of Latinas with a PhD. So for this study, I had 24 Latinas who earned their PhD from an accredited university. They reside in the US and were willing to discuss their PhD experience with or without a mentor. I also chose PhD and not an EDD because a PhD is research-based, contributing new insights to the field. For Latinas in academia to overcome challenges, they need mentors to negotiate their background successfully within academia. Therefore, I pose the following 2 research questions. 1, how do Latinas who earn PhDs describe the role of mentoring in supporting their degree completion in higher education? And 2, how, if at all, did Latinas who earned PhDs negotiate cultural and gender identities in academia with a mentor? This study is meant to utilize the term Latina to include pluralistic, not singular, identities of women with different pasts, different social privileges, and who speak different forms of Spanish. As the author, I focused on the plurality of Latina participants who explored their historical oppressions, national identities, and linguistic practices. The literature review is in conversation or building on or extending the work of these scholars on which shoulders I stand. Together, these 3 frameworks, in combination with the methodology, which is testimonial, served as a lens to understand the 24 Latinas through their identities and experiences and how they have responded to oppression. LatCrit stems from critical race theory and empowers marginalized populations. Mestiza consciousness was used as a gendered analysis, and Mujerista mentoring is about mentoring which guides and supports Latinas. So I began with the research problem, which led to 2 research questions, which led to 3 frameworks, and the methodology of testimonios. So despite the continuous tensions the doctoras faced, they were persistent in overcoming navigational barriers and finishing their PhDs. 18 of the 24 testimonialistas, or doctoras in this study, felt that their mentors created spaces for them in academia. The Latinas in this study currently hold leadership roles across the United States. They hold power and influence which did not belong to people of color in the past. They are pioneers in education, policy and research, the medical field, and business. I am honored to have them as participants and a community of support. So I began with the concept of Scholar Familia by Cynthia Villarreal, which was like a compass for me, leading to the data analysis. On the right is a roadmap of the data analysis. I began with Testimonios, one-on-one, which led to focus groups of 3 to 5 participants. Then I had a member check. From that was the coding of 329 points of data. And I went through the corpus of data to code and identify 4 themes. In this slide represented here are how the themes connect to each other, how they address the research questions, and my findings. Theme number 1, navigational barriers, or barreras dolorosas. They came up with the 4 main themes of barriers, which is negative experiences in academia, onlyness, low representation, and lacking mentorship guidance. In theme number 2, identity through mentorship and Scholar Familia, there is genuine love there. The findings from the data were grounded in community, a lifetime of mentorship, and familia. And in theme 3, which is assets, la cultura, and gender, that had findings from connections to heritage, the power of motherhood, and finding the right tribe. Theme number 4, feminist energy, my existence is my resistance, had findings which were confianza, values, and to claim space. Research suggests that mentorship can support Latinas in successfully obtaining a PhD. Next, I will give an example of a testimonio. Across the 4 themes, I heard the power of testimonials. Here's an example of a testimonio conducted by a voice actor using a pseudonym. In theme number 1, Daisy, the only Latina in her PhD program, describes her feelings of not being validated.
That we are not valued hurts. It makes me want to cry because I think in many of the institutions that I've worked or where I've been a student, my value there is a quota. It always feels that way. My value to them is that we have a Latina in this cohort and that's it. That's so sad. I don't want to talk about it anymore. I never had a Latina teacher. It should be diverse and the university should be diverse. Now I'm teaching at the state university and honestly, I'm the only one. And so it makes a difference because when you don't see us in these jobs, you think that they're not for us. They're not attainable.
Daisy's husband made her choose between having babies or working on her PhD. She chose the PhD. She carries a lot of guilt about her divorce. Mentoring contributes to increasing the number of Latinas earning doctorates. Research has suggested that mentorship could challenge oppression and transform educational spaces to support Latinas in navigating the doctoral journey more successfully. This study implies that we still need a more humanistic approach to inclusivity. We need to hire more Latina faculty, to decolonize the coursework and value cultural differences, and tenure evaluations should place value on mentorship. My reflection on this study, this journey, and this completion of my PhD in relation to the participants I've engaged in has led to a very rich substance. Thank you, everyone. Mil gracias for attending this session. And with that, I will end.
Thank you so much. Let's just yeah, give a round of a virtual applause and just thank Dr. Rangel for her presentation. Thank you so much, Dr. Rangel. Again, if any questions came up for you, please, you're always welcome to put in the chat. Again, the Q&A will begin after all the presenters. Okay. Next, we have Christopher Norris Silva. Please, Christopher, I'm going to make you co-host here so you can share your screen.
All right, thank you.
Yep. So 1 second here. Okay, you should be all set.
All right, can you guys all see that?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, good. All right. Hello, everyone, and thank you again to CESR and all the wonderful folks at Latinx Connect who put this conference together. It has been a wonderful space thus far, and I'm looking forward to adding to the ongoing conversations that we've been having. Particularly, we've been talking about a lot of different identities crossing over in intersectionality at this conference, and I wanted to talk about one of the emerging sub-ethnic identities that we're seeing right now amongst Latinos in the US, and that is the contemporary Taino identity. Now, when you think about Tainos, you probably are thinking about suppression. You're thinking about Columbus, quote unquote, discovering the Caribbean. You're thinking about the Spanish casta system that suppressed the identities and the rights of not only Tainos, but also Black Africans in the Caribbean and Latin America during this time period. And while this is something I want to get over pretty quickly because this is sort of the dominant narrative when it comes to Tainos, and what happened afterwards is what is kind of glossed over, I do want to acknowledge one theory that draws on this time period, which is that of Svet Todorov, a sociologist who wrote in French, and his historiography of the Tainos is notoriously flawed, and I don't agree with it. Nor do I agree with his sort of theory, his structuralist theory of human interaction. But what he does present is this idea of the double movement, in which uh, ethnic groups upon first contact will see each other as, in this case, different and thus inferior, or similar and thus on equal grounds, or different and thus superior. In this case, the Spaniards, when they first came to the Caribbean, they were the dominant world power. They were above France, they were above Britain, and they were flying with this, especially Columbus himself, with a very proselytizing attitude when it came to the Catholic Church. And they had this real sense of superiority. And looking at the Tainos and then their sociological structures, which did not resemble the absolute monarchy in Spain, their spiritual practices, which did not resemble Catholicism, and their language, which was nothing like Spanish, they would see them as different and thus inferior. And the ensuing several hundred years would be indicative of that. And these, of course, like I mentioned earlier, these identities were going to be suppressed through casta and eventually through mestizaje. And when it comes to mestizaje, for those of you who don't know what that is, I'm going to quote two excerpts from my paper to describe that for you and sort of why it was, why it was important understanding the evolution of the Taino identity. Although the means were different, it had the same ends in sight: erase the indigenous identity from Latin America. Person residing on the eastern Spanish-speaking side of Hispaniola, or Quisqueya in Taino, was now Dominican, not a Taino, and the centuries of imperialism up to this point had already taken away the Taino language, religion, and culture from the now Dominican identifying person in question. It did not matter whether the Dominican was the descendant of Tainos, forcefully enslaved East Africans, Spaniards, or a mixed race person with ancestors from all three continents. The Taino identity, the last remnant of the Tainos, would disappear in the wake of whitening and mestizaje, phenomenon that would only worsen in the predominant destination for Latin Americans in the 20th century, the United States. Mestizo did not have a face or a name, but through its apartheid-esque political leadership, which is to say, white leadership at the top, use of the European Spanish language, Catholic faith, and the legacy of whitening and imperialism, the Latin American republics were able to create a homogenized identity instead of individual ones based on indigenous, African, or European ancestry. Furthermore, to the world, anyone identifying as Latin American could simply be considered Spanish, as that was the identity that was their parent culture in Spain and their colonial master in Spain, thus accomplishing the goal of whitening. Mestizaje became widely promoted national identity in the 30s and 40s, as did the Brazilian equivalent, mestizaje, under the leadership of Getulio Vargas in Brazil from 1930 to 46 and 51 to 54. And in the decades that followed, Latin American migration would rise in the United States dramatically. And this is all to say that this is a destructive identity in many ways, even though at the time it was seen as very constructive, given the precedent was scientific racism and whitening. So as I alluded to there, in the decades that followed, there was massive migration coming from the Caribbean to the US. Puerto Ricans and Cubans migrated around the mid-20th century with a big jump for Cubans following the revolution. Dominicans were a later development. This happened sort of in the 1990s and 2000s. And now we do not know how many of these individuals identified as Taino or had Taino heritage. We don't have those numbers. But we can presume that a fraction of this population had some Taino identity or would eventually recapture that Taino identity in the decades that followed. Because what we're going to see in the decades that followed this migration is the Taino revival movement, which had to happen with these settings of having these migrant diasporas in the US in order to occur the way that it did. And when these Tainos came to the US, they truly became urban Indians. And I'm saying urban Indians as in contrast to reservation-based native peoples. Urban Indians as in people who lived far from their ancestral lands, usually in cities, and certainly away from reservations. In the Taino case, they neither have reservation or recognition from the federal government to speak of, neither under the federal, U.S. government, nor in the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, nor elsewhere, and especially not in the context of getting funding from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Regardless, the Tainos became urban Indians upon arriving in the mainland U.S. and would inherently carry that identity with them. So this is the first chart I'd like to show. Puerto Rican population to the U.S. As you can see, it really began to grow in the 50s and 60s. It's been very steady growth since then, still increasing quite gradually. Cuban population, kind of a similar look a little bit later with the jump after the revolution. And then Dominican population was a more recent development here. So the identity. So as this urban Indianness that I'm discussing here, it's important because at the same time, the American Indian movement's going on. And this is mostly happening in the West, and this is happening in the context of sort of federal violence towards Native Americans and reservations. And unlike the idea of what sort of Indian Native American was prior to the pan-Indian idea and the urban Indian idea, it was a fairly exclusive idea because the official definition of Native American in the U.S. is someone enrolled in a federal tribe. And not all tribes that have existed in the U.S. are recognized. The Lenape are not recognized, nor the Tainos, of course. And when you have people who are living, as I said, far from their homelands, lack reservations, lack recognition, and were of mixed-race heritage, pan-Indianism was welcoming to them. And this pan-Indian identity eventually ended up encouraging not only people who were Latinos, but also other urban Indians and Native Alaskans who identify as Native American or Indian. And we see that in the census results that are going to occur in the late 20th century, in which the amount of Native Americans jumps very high because people who had not been encouraged to identify as such in the past began identifying as it in that time period. Now, urban Indian scholars often write about the conflict of who can identify as Indian. And this is a challenge of pan-Indianism that does not have a single solution. And it's largely a dichotomy of reservation-based versus urban Indians. Now, across the board, blood quantum is very much disagreed upon as a reasonable result. For urban Indians, usually because they are mixed race, for reservation-based Indians because they don't participate in this type of DNA sampling. So blood quantum is almost never seen as the solution to who can be Indian. For those on reservations, the gatekeeping is usually based on this idea of the lived experience of being on a reservation or being in a federally recognized tribe as having a sort of legitimacy to it. Obviously, one derived from the colonial master, which is why pan-Indianism is pretty rejecting of that. And certainly for Tainos who don't have a reservation, in the mainland U.S., they're all urban Indians. This pan-Indian identity, which encouraged them to identify more with being native, was a strong tool in revitalizing the Taino identity. If you can identify as Indian, then you can be Taino. And this extends to all Latinos, not just Caribbean Americans, of course. So in this time period, too, you have a emergence of sort of Taino organizations. And these are urban Indian organizations. They're not reservations. Reservations, like I said, this requires the federal government to step in. In this case, these are urban Indian organizations. And they have a lot of fundamental challenges of other urban Indian organizations, which is chiefly the lack of funding. Most urban Indian collectives fail because they don't get funding from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. You need money to run these things, especially if you want to reach the ambition of the organizing achieved by AIM, the American Indian Movement, in the 1970s. But with the Taino identity in particular, the main schism that's going to occur in the 90s is actually due to religion. It's because early Taino organizations often had very Catholic leadership, which made sense given the overwhelming presence of Catholicism amongst Latinos across races and across national origin. However, when you have a Taino organization where the high command is Catholic, there is an inherent paradox in that, given the church's role in the cultural imperialism, given the church's role in casta, where you had to be Catholic to be a citizen at all. And it creates a barrier in the ongoing decolonization efforts for those, especially in the spiritual community at this point, who are trying to revive spiritual traditions, who want to distance themselves from the church and embrace Taino spirituality as their system of ritual and belief. And following this schism, there ends up being a reconciliatory conference that you can see pictured here in 2001. And in 1998, 3 years prior, a group called the Anti-Confederation of Taino People, or the UCTP, was founded as sort of a compromise group, which was very, very much so built to be uncontroversial and not attach itself to spirituality nor to Catholicism. And the UCTP, the success of the UCTP is sort of debated in amongst the Taino community. Some say you can't even have the U in there because they're not really united. They're not especially active in terms like putting on like a constant stream of events. But I argue that they are very successful because they are not trying to do that. They will defer usually to regional groups to take on those responsibilities. There are many regional city-based Taino groups or other urban Indian collectives that can fill that role. I say it's successful for two reasons. Number one, it survived for a very long time, and these things don't last very long usually. And number two is they give Tainos something to point to in lieu of a reservation, in lieu of formal recognition in terms of symbology, leadership, and a broader sense of community across the US. Because they're based in New York, they don't have a physical location. They only have a PO box. So no matter where you are in the US, you can enroll with them through self-identification and have that be a part of you and reinforce the legitimacy of your Taino identity. As for spirituality, we're going to now visit the question of what is religion and who defines religion. And the answer to that, especially in the 19th century and certainly in the 18th century, was white Europeans. And white Europeans would define religion in terms really of Christianity. And in terms of, occasionally you'd see in terms of Abrahamic religion more broadly, but usually in terms of Christianity, to the point where even maybe Islam, Judaism would not be included. Certainly not Native American religions, certainly not Indo-Pacific religions, certainly not even Hinduism for that matter, or Buddhism for that matter. It was Abrahamic religion is religion. Everyone else are idolaters. They are fetishists. They are heathens. And that certainly included, like I said, Native American religion. And that definitely was the case when it came to religious freedom, as although the First Amendment includes a clause for religious freedom, they did not consider Native American spirituality to qualify as religion. Native Americans did not actually have religious freedom until 1978 with the American Indian Religious Freedom Act of that same year, which was amended again in the 90s to extend its definition a bit further. Because before that, it was considered, like I said, heathenry, idolatry, and residential schools played a very big part in trying to destroy that across the U.S. There's a Native American scholar and pastor named Woodley, by the name of Woodley, who talks about kind of the inherent paradox of being Christian and being Native American as well. But he also says that as a Native American who is a Christian, he does see that there are connections through Jesus's teachings of equity and goodness of the land. So there still is, a legitimacy in one believing in that church or having syncretic beliefs for that matter. But the reason I'm putting a very strong emphasis on the Taino belief system and spirituality is that it was key to the revival movement because it is rejecting the very institution that stripped away so much of the Taino identity centuries ago. And as aforementioned, like I said, it really was a forcible assimilation that took away what was so important to this group. And I do think it's worth going over just some of the basics of this belief system. I don't have enough time to go into the details, but it's about as far as Christianity as it can get. For one, the Tsemis are not gods. They are not supernatural. They are one with nature. And they play roles comparable to gods of other polytheist traditions, but they are not gods. They are one with nature, not supernatural. The calendar is lunar as opposed to solar, and the perception of time is cyclical as opposed to linear. And the underworld, for that matter, in the cyclical cycle, is both where you come from when you were born and where you go when you die. And it's comparable to a womb, particularly the womb of the creator, Atabe. And yeah, this belief system has now been revived chiefly in organizations, namely the Kene Spiritual Circle, which is very active here in Pittsburgh. This here is an image of the Chief Bahiki of the Kene Spiritual Circle, who is very active in Pittsburgh, originally from Erie, Pennsylvania. And it actually has led to these traditions being reintroduced into the Caribbean, traditions that were conceptualized in the US and then reintroduced to bring that back in the Caribbean as well. Just some concluding thoughts on this. I think it's very important to also bring up a very good text on identity called After the Last Sky, Palestinian Lives by Edward Said. Talks a bit about kind of statelessness and finding home when you don't have one. It's written in the context of the initial kind of disbursement of Palestinians in the wake of the establishment of the State of Israel and migration, the challenges of migration and not having, in this case, within a reservation, Palestinians a nation state at that period of time. And I also wanted to close with this idea, once again, the cyclical nature of the Taino worldview. Semis, like I said, natural, supernatural. And one of the chief semis, who you can see over here, portrayed in this statue at the Met in New York is Yokohu, who is the semi of life. And he's analogous to plant life. He actually dies in the autumn and is reborn in the spring. And I find that the cycle of the Taino identity is very similar to that. It was suppressed, it was forced into the underworld, and then it came back, it was revived. And I think it's a very beautiful cycle and a beautiful way to end this presentation, this theory I produced on why this revival occurred and why it happened the way it did. And also just kind of to bring closure on this whole topic, especially now as the Taino identity is a very strong force in decolonizing Latino-ness and decolonizing Mestizaje. So yes, I thank you all very much for your attention. And once again, thank you to CESR and the folks over at Latinx Connect for putting on this conference. It's been a pleasure thus far, and I can't wait to hear what everyone else has to say.
Victor, I think you're on mute.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Christopher. Thank you for your presentation. Please join the chat to thank Christopher. Indigeneity is often invisibilized and so rendered invisible. And so thank you, Christopher, for rendering visible for Taino revitalization because it is often not talked about. And so thank you. Now next, I would love to bring to you all and introduce to our next two presenters for the next lightning round talk, Courtney Medina and Daniel Labrousse. Please. I'm gonna make do y'all have a preference on who I can make co-host?
I think Daniel would be good.
All right, Daniel. Okay. Let me find you here and make you co-host.
Can everyone see my screen?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, yep, you're all set.
Okay, great. And can everyone hear me? I want to make sure first.
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you so much. Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Courtney Medina. My co-presenter is Daniel Labrousse. We are first-year PhD students in the Department of Psychology here at Pitt. We are doing our PhD in developmental psychology specifically, and today we'll be presenting an overview of a project called Centering Mexican Strength. The project is called Proyecto Vencer, Violence Exposure in College Mexican Emerging Adults and Resilience Study. And just to give you a roadmap of our talk, we aim to provide some recommendations for researchers that look at things like violence exposure among youth, as well as identifying protective factors. And then we will use Proyecto Vencer as an example of some of these recommendations we have for violence and resiliency focused research. And we can go ahead and also begin with an overview of who the CREA Lab is. Can you see this? Sorry, no. Sorry, we were trying to change slides, but I don't think it was working.
Yeah, you may have to reshare.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. Thank you. And so just to introduce you to who the CREA Lab is, the CREA Lab is a research lab in the developmental psychology area in the Department of Psychology here at Pitt. Our lab director is Andrea Medrano, and we are a team made up of graduate researchers, postbac fellows, and undergrad researchers that all aim to help promote resiliency, especially for Latinx and youth of color in the context of risk factors, and we mainly focus on violence exposure and victimization and how that affects youth. So as I mentioned, we are as a lab focused on violence exposure, and as researchers that also focus on Latinx youth, and specifically this study looks at violence exposure in Mexico, it's important to understand that youth in Mexico are at risk to exposure to multiple forms of violence. For example, in one region of Mexico, 61% of adolescents reported experiencing at least one form of neighborhood violence. And in a rural Mexican region, about 77% of adolescents reported hearing gunshots outside or near their home. And so it's clear that, that many adolescents in different regions across Mexico experience community violence. However, we as a lab think it's also important to consider gender-based violence and the risk in which adolescents face experiencing gender-based violence. For example, there was over 1,000 reported femicides in Mexico in 2021. And a femicide, just so for everyone's understanding, is the murder of a woman where gender was a main factor in that murder and that violence. So that just kind of provides one statistic of the context of gender-based violence in Mexico. And it's also important to think about that violence exposure includes both witnessing and personal victimization of violence. So it may not always be the case that a youth is personally involved in a violent act, but they might witness something vicariously, see a violent act in the neighborhood or on their street. And that should also be considered as part of the conceptualization of violence exposure. And then finally, it's also important to think about polyvictimization, which is being victimized by multiple forms of violence, because polyvictimization puts youth at an especially increased risk for negative psychological and academic outcomes. A lot of research has looked at how polyvictimization affects internalizing problems, which are things like anxiety and depressive symptoms, as well as post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms. Something else important to keep in mind is the desensitization hypothesis, which is the idea that as youth are exposed more frequently to violence and to different forms of violence, that this may lead to a desensitization or a way where violence becomes more normalized psychologically, and therefore may put youth at an increased risk to continue to experience violence or have difficulty identifying when violence is occurring to them or in their community. And so, as I mentioned, something important to our work in the CLEAR Lab is community violence exposure. And we aim to move past kind of traditional conceptualizations of community violence exposure, or CVE. Traditional conceptualizations of community violence typically include weapon-related violence, robberies, physical assaults, or threats. Especially the violence research in Mexico has mainly focused on cartel and physical violence risks, which are real and dominant violence risks for youth in Mexico. However, we feel it's very important to move to a more comprehensive conceptualization of community violence. And we think that that should include the exposure to gender-based violence. For example, Dr. Medrano found in a recent study that the effect of sexual harassment victimization on depressive and post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms was larger than traditional community violence victimization among both boy and girl Mexican adolescents. So this is just an example of how, if we continue to exclude gender-based violence in our conceptualization of community violence exposure, we are therefore not understanding the full breadth, the full range of different violence, different types of violence that youth are exposed to, and therefore are also missing out some of the mechanisms that may negatively affect youth in Mexico's mental health and well-being. Finally, discrimination, we argue, should also be considered in the conceptualization of community violence more broadly, and especially the role of intersectional identities. I'm sure most people are familiar with intersectionality theory and how youth in Mexico, or Latinx youth more broadly, that hold marginalized racial or queer, or even things like a migration status, could all put youth at an increased risk for violence exposure, and discrimination itself is also a form of violence.
It is also important to note that the research in this study, Proyecto Vencer, as well as the research from the CREA lab, does use a strength-based framework, given psychology's history and traditionally studying different communities using deficit-based approach, focusing on negative outcomes for individuals and communities. Proyecto Vencer draws from a strength-based approach to take into account cultural factors and to ensure that the research is culturally relevant. This not only allows us to understand the nuance in the experiences of Mexican emerging adults, but also highlight protective factors. So previous research with Mexican communities has shown that different protective factors can not only mitigate some negative effects, so identity and cultural values, for example, ethnic pride and identity affirmation have been found to support Mexicans' positive youth development. And identity affirmation actually for Mexican boys has been found to buffer the negative effects of discrimination on externalizing behaviors. Social responsibility and respect for elders and family has also been seen to provide a buffer for Mexican adolescents. Social support research has also shown that high social support has reduced depressive symptoms for Mexican women who are at risk of being exposed to intimate partner violence. And in particular, parental support has been found to buffer the effects of violence exposure and depressive symptoms for adolescent girls. And finally, community resiliency has been found, for Mexican communities to protect them from historical trauma narratives. Community resiliency primarily rooted in querencia y concientización. Querencia being this connection to land, home, and people, and this second protective factor being about critical consciousness. So to get more into the specifics of Proyecto Vencer, it is important to acknowledge the setting. The study is located in Michoacan, which is in the west central part of Mexico. This area is known as the Soul of Mexico. It is also located, the setting, in Uruapan, which is the second largest city in Michoacan. And Uruapan comes from a Purpecha word, which is interpreted to mean the place where everything flowers, or even some have said internal spring. And the population in the region right now is estimated to be around 356,000 individuals. And this is really important to note, given that this project is working closely with the community to develop the project. For example, in April, the study and team will be collecting initial thoughts from the undergraduate research team in Mexico regarding the survey development, because it is really important to do community engaged research when studying not just international communities, but communities that tend to be historically minoritized. And so the study is a longitudinal study. The goal sample is 525 emerging adults from the age range of 18 to 25. There will be 3 waves of data collection, and our hypotheses are that 1, Mexican emerging adults who are polyvictimized will report worse academic and psychological outcomes compared to those who experience only one form of violence or no violence at all. And then the second hypothesis is around the family, school, neighborhood, and cultural level factors that will be protective. For example, greater school belonging, we hypothesize will moderate the link between polyvictimization and emerging adults' depression. And also greater neighborhood belonging will moderate the link between polyvictimization and emerging adults' PTSD symptoms.
And so we also felt it was important to provide some examples of some of the measures we'll be using in Proyecto Vencer for anyone that aims to collect violence exposure research in the future. Maybe that's some things that some of y'all are currently doing. And so, as I mentioned, we in the lab conceptualize violence exposure a little bit more broadly and comprehensively than traditional conceptualizations. So some of our violence exposure measures, we use a community violence exposure, which gets at some of those more traditional conceptualizations of CVE. We also use a Mexican street harassment measure, which gets at some of those gender-based violence risks. We also measure adverse childhood experiences using the international questionnaire, and that will get at things like childhood neglect or abuse. And then for our outcome measures, looking at mental health and socio-emotional outcomes to violence exposure, we use the Center for Epidemiological Studies depression scale. We also use the perceived stress scale and the PTSD checklist civilian version. And then finally, as we have stated, we think it's really important to identify protective and moderating factors for violence exposure in order to use a strengths-based and resiliency framework in our research, and to amplify the protective factors that are already situated within the communities that we work with in Mexico. And so some examples of these measures include the interpersonal support evaluation. So that'll look at support systems that youth have either with their friends, family members, and how social support is a really important protective factor. Something I'm especially interested in is the social roles questionnaire. So that assesses traditional gender roles, attitudes towards gender norms. And so we argue that Mexican youth with less traditional gender attitudes or gender norms may be a protective factor against some, especially gender-based violence exposure. Also culturally relevant protective and moderating factors, we look at things like machismo and marianismo, and finally also neighborhood social cohesion. So how socially connected one feels to their neighborhood, their neighbors, and their community more broadly. And to give you kind of an idea of where Proyecto Vencer is, our grant is still currently under review. We have already started submitting materials to the IRB, and we have revisions that have been submitted, and we're already working on those. And as Daniel mentioned, we aim to do 3 waves of data collection across the fall of 2024 into the spring of 2025. And in April, we will be conducting some community-based evaluations with some of the, we have a research team made up of undergraduates in Michoacan. So we'll be getting some of their feedback on some of the materials that we aim to use before we begin our formal data collection. And we'll be doing analyses at each wave.
So just want to end on a quick summary of this presentation. Given the timeline of the project, and very shortly in April, the team will be collecting feedback from the community on the survey for the studies. Proyecto Vencer is a longitudinal study, 3-wave design. It is in an urban university setting in Michoacan, and the CREA lab studies community well-being using strength resilience frameworks to understand the relation between violence exposure, and in particular for this study, polyvictimization, with academic and psychological outcomes. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending. We want to thank Latinx Connect and the co-chairs who have put on this amazing conference for the second day, as well as the CREA Lab, PI of the project and director of the lab, Dr. Andrea Medrano, the co-PI for the project, Dr. Alex Rojas. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Courtney and Daniel. Please, everyone, let's join me in thanking Daniel and Courtney. Thank you all so much. And please, again, for those who are joining in the middle or joining now, please feel free to put any questions in the chat. We'll be having a Q&A after our next two poster presentations. All right, and so we're going to transition to our poster presentations. And first, we're going to start with Elaine Mora. So please, join me in welcoming Elaine Mora. I'm going to give you, I'm going to make you co-host, Elaine. So sorry, make sure that, okay. You should be co-host now. You should be able to share your screen.
Thank you so much. Alrighty, I'll go ahead and begin. So my study is on the psychological well-being among college students with a history of childhood trauma or past trauma. And I know the words are kind of small here, and I wanted to put this in a PowerPoint, but I wanted you to see everything together. So the abstract, going to college, especially for students right out of high school, is a very crucial milestone for many individuals. They're entering adulthood. It's their first time indicating a period where their personal development, academic achievement, and the exploration of newly discovered independence. Now, upon doing this study, I realized as I started to collect data for undergraduate students, in my head, I thought undergrad, fresh out of high school, they're coming to college, but I've learned there's many individuals that choose to come back to college, regardless of their age or their past history, their work history. And I saw a lot of older adults as well wanting to come back. And that was very interesting. I'll get a little bit more into that when I get to the results. But psychological well-being, this refers to living an enjoyable and meaningful life, as well as achieving personal growth and self-awareness. Emotional, cognitive, and social well-being, these are all components of psychological well-being that collectively have a significant impact in an individual's academic performance, their productivity levels, and overall well-being. In addition, an individual's psychological well-being determines their social interaction with others and the way they interact with others at their work setting, at home, in the community, things of that nature. Adverse childhood experiences, the ability to regulate emotions, and the willingness to practice mindfulness, these are all key characteristics that might influence negatively or positively the psychological well-being of an individual. My three variables for this study are adverse childhood experiences, emotional regulation, and mindfulness. So adverse childhood experiences, these are potentially traumatic situations that have been found to have detrimental long-term impacts on a person's mental health, as well as their physical well-being. They often experience it in childhood, or at least the individuals within my study, they'll experience it in childhood, and that lingers into adulthood if not provided proper services in childhood or even in later adulthood when they're ready to share and receive the help. Emotional regulation, this is the process of controlling, responding, or modulating one's emotional experiences, which includes the ability to detect, analyze, and effectively manage diverse emotions that they might be experiencing. There are several different examples of emotional dysregulation, such as an individual having angry outbursts, suddenly an individual emotionally having a hard time with their emotions. Maybe they'll be in a very good mood and suddenly they feel really distressed and they're crying. So there's a lot of key components and signs as to why an individual might be struggling with their emotions. And with the study, we're seeing that the emotional regulations are greatly impacted based on the trauma that an individual has experienced. Now, mindfulness, of course, refers to a particular way of paying attention the ability or propensity to engage in non-elaborate, non-judgmental, and present-centered awareness with each thought, feeling, or sensation that might arise. Now, the purpose of my study is to estimate, predict the psychological well-being among college students with past trauma, as well as identify areas of a need for future research. So that way we might improve the psychological well-being for underserved minorities at a Hispanic serving institution. Overall, I hope to expand the study to more institutions. I'm focusing just on the University of Texas Rio Grande Valley, which is the school that I am at deep in South Texas. And there we are a Hispanic serving institution, meaning that we have about 80% of our students are primarily Hispanic. And so I did focus my study on just UTRGV, but upon doing more research, I see there are many individuals, many minorities that are experiencing this form of trauma and that is getting impacted due to their experiences with trauma. Now, my research questions: how do adverse childhood experiences impact the psychological well-being of undergraduate college students? What is the relationship between adverse childhood experiences and emotional regulation among undergraduate college students? What are the benefits of emotional regulation for undergraduate college students with a history of childhood trauma and/or distress in adulthood? And do adverse childhood experiences, emotional dysregulation, and lack of mindfulness impact the psychological well-being of undergraduate college students? This was a mixed sample of undergraduate students from multiple disciplines. We recruited participants by originally sending out an email with a survey to a link that we created on Qualtrics to educators and professors. I actually sent it out to deans. I believe I may have sent it out to the provost. I sent it just to everybody, trying to recruit more students. And when that didn't work, I went ahead and made a flyer, and I went out, the old school way. I went to the university and I started handing out flyers to about 500 undergraduate students. When I started handing out flyers personally, I felt that the students really were able to connect with the study and properly or thoroughly understand what the purpose was. And we went from 44 participants to we're almost at about 300. So we do want to reach 300 or a little bit more so we can have better reliability and validity in our results. And at this point, we're getting pretty close to that number, so we're very excited. The inclusion criteria, the students need to be 18 years or older, undergraduate students, and currently enrolled at UTRGV. The exclusionary criteria would make them not eligible. However, I want to mention that everything was completely voluntary. The grades were not impacted to our participants, and we had no identifying information. Everything was collected and stored in a secure database, so that way we can protect the identities of our students that decide to participate. Now, I wonder if I'm going to try to zoom in here. So these present findings, they are a smaller sample size. We do plan, as I mentioned, to increase that sample size for final publication so we can improve the reliability of our results. But I did want to show with the 95 participants, we have 33 male, 62 female, 18 to 25. You can see it has the majority, and of course, Hispanic, 84 of the students were Hispanic. What was interesting is that the seniors were showing to have participated more. We did do 4 validated data collection instruments. That was the RIF psychological well-being, short difficulties in emotional regulation, cognitive and affective mindfulness scale, and adverse childhood experience questionnaire. And I apologize, I'm going so fast. I'm trying to get to the end so we can have it all. Now, we did use inferential and descriptive statistics to analyze the results and draw conclusions. And I'm just going to jump over here to the results section. After running the Cranbach Alpha, we realized that it was low. The reliability was showing low. So we had to do away with the mindfulness scale, unfortunately, the variable. But I wanted to still mention that because studies were showing that mindfulness is shown to improve psychological well-being for individuals that have experienced trauma. However, the linear multiple regression was statistically significant, and the best predictor of psychological well-being was the level of difficulty in emotional regulation, meaning that the more difficult or the more challenging it is for an individual to regulate those emotions, the more likelihood that their psychological well-being is going to be impacted. In addition, the adverse childhood experiences was negatively correlated to psychological well-being. So the more trauma an individual experienced in childhood, studies or the results are showing that this is negatively impacting their overall psychological well-being. And of course, emotional regulation was negatively correlated to psychological well-being, while adverse childhood experiences was correlated to emotional regulation. So depending on the impact of trauma or how much trauma an individual has experienced, this is causing a great deal of emotional dysregulation among the college students, the undergrads, and the adverse childhood experiences, as it says, again, it was negatively impacted. The difficulty in emotional regulation, this too was showing to be an impact or a factor as to why students are having a more challenging time balancing that well-being, the overall well-being, psychological well-being of the college students. And I think I'm out of time. I'm so sorry for rushing through that. And
Thank
before, you. I'm so
Oh,
sorry.
no, you're all set. You can continue. Sorry.
Okay.
I thought you were done. Yep.
And just the last thing, I didn't touch base on the procedure. So as I mentioned, the questionnaires, they did have an informed consent. We made sure to let the students know if there was any experiences or any triggers or anything like that, that repressed memories or things that might have caused them to be re-traumatized. We do have a counseling center at our university that is available at no cost for students. So we went ahead and put that information at the bottom of the informed consent and made sure to let them know to seek that help if need be. Because of course, doing research with past trauma, the kind of questions that we asked involved sexual abuse, physical abuse, neglect, exposure to guns, sex, violence, things of that nature, crime. So we really wanted to ensure that we had proper protocol as to how to help our students following their participation if they chose to participate. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Elaine. Please join me in thanking Elaine. Thank you so much. All right, and so we're now going to transition to our final presentation. Please, we have now Irene Sofía Castillo Maldonado. Thank you. I'm gonna make you co-host. Sorry.
No worries, no worries. Hi,
Yep.
good morning, everybody. I hope y'all have been having a great time and have been enjoying this whole process as much as I have. Bear with me, this is my first ever poster presentation, so I am a bit nervous, but I'm glad to be sharing this work with y'all. So I'm so excited to share my proposal, The Hiker, Exploring Monuments Through a Collective Lens, during these short minutes. This proposal is currently being worked on. Let me plug in my computer before it dies. This proposal is currently being worked on during my first half of my year-long Humanities Center fellowship here at the university with my mentor, Dr. Kirk Savage, and grad student TA, Rebecca Lowry. I am more than open to suggestions, recommendations, and comments, so feel free to give me all your stories and opinions. I'm gonna put my computer to charge real quick. It's about to die, and I don't want that to happen mid-conference, but give me 5 seconds. I am back. So sorry for those technical issues. So my research grapples with colonial memory in Pittsburgh. So specifically the Spanish-American War and how it is memorialized. using the hiker, the statue seen in the poster. It's a sculpture found by Shenley Drive behind the Frick Fine Arts building in our campus. I'm going to be using it as an anchor for my writing, and I plan to develop a safe space for discussing questions with the statue, such as what histories are in spotlight? How do we look at Puerto Rico, Cuba, China, and the Philippines histories when they are so inlaid in their colonial context? How do we look at intersecting histories from the 21st century? For this research, I want to produce an archive and record of discussion through a community tour to question what it means to have colonial stories in our campus. To produce the sources necessary for my written report, I will create a workshop that will run from the end of summer to early fall. I intend to solicit ideas and information from the people who participate in the project. I am more interested in their thoughts than in providing them with facts of colonial history of my home and my friend's home, to be honest. I want to see how people are currently looking at and thinking about colonial histories within the United States. My method of recording, art, and archiving this material will be surveys offered through before, during, and after the workshop. The questions offered in the survey will be straightforward, for my intention is not to prime anybody's answers. The questions follow the idea of writing, drafting, sketching, or imagining verbs, nouns, or adjectives to define the feelings, emotions, thoughts, and biases that come up when working with this history and statue. The questions are not pedagogical, where there is no right or wrong answer on what it means to answer them. Most of the participants in the workshop will be random samples from the general community, but there will be control groups looking specifically at people who identify with the countries and institutions mentioned within the statue, such as Puerto Rico, Cuba, Philippines, and China. I also want to have ROTCs and veterans participate in this workshop. These groups will include Pittsburgh residents, but also people who were born and raised in said countries. So having veterans from Puerto Rico, for example, to contribute to the archive. I opened this bridge of communication to propose the idea of imagining together, to go with the theme of the conference, the stories that are mentioned in the statue. The reason I want to do this research is because this was the first mention I saw of my home within campus when I first moved here 3-ish years ago, and it's mostly ignored. And I do not want to keep avoiding the statue. We should not keep avoiding the artwork on our campus. My research will not just allow us to look at the past of the sculpture, but also to see a possible future for it that is decided by the residents of Pittsburgh and the people who participate vividly on these histories. Communities deserve to choose whose stories where and how they are narrated. Thank you so much for listening and enjoying my research with me. Thank you to CESR for this conference and for allowing me to participate with such amazing presentations. Good afternoon, and please send me all your advice, letters, anything, stories. I am more than interested in that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Irene. Please join me in thanking Irene for her presentation, for a poster. As well, just let's take time to also thank everyone and all the presenters. Thank you all so much for sharing all your work with us. I'd like to now, let's transition into Q&A. And so I know I've seen a question or two in the chat, but please, any questions you may have or may be coming up for you, you can also either raise your virtual hand or unmute yourself as well and share your question. But I'm going to go here to first to one of the first questions that I saw in the chat earlier. Okay, and so this question it's from Irene to Christopher. Okay, Irene says, great presentation. I wanted to ask if you knew that these concepts that are being produced in the United States are meeting with the ones produced in the Caribbean. I know, for example, that the town of Juncos maintains alive the Taino culture. how are these already present stories in the Caribbean that had been maintained meeting with the United States?
So yeah, these are very much so happening in conjunction with one another, in relation with one another. The development of like the kind of spiritual circles teachings was done explicitly with the assistance of people from Mayans from Yucatan, because of the interactions between Tainos and Mayans over that very short kind of strait between Cuba and Yucatan, and also with folks from North and South America. And the UCTP maintains connections to international Taino groups from North and South America and the Caribbean, and their personnel routinely are visiting the Caribbean to engage with them with their traditions. The man in the photo earlier, the Vehique in the photo earlier, also works with the UCTP. His job with UCTP is ambassador to Cuba. And about 10 years ago, he went down there to one urban Indian group and one mountain indigenous group that had maintained its traditions for several centuries. And essentially, to have conversations with both sides of this sort of identity, because urban Indians exist in the Caribbean too. But also, he was chiefly there actually to get this stick that he had made blessed by two different sides of the Dino identity in the Caribbean. And that stick was going to be used in this marathon across the Americas in commemoration of the 500-year anniversary. It began with the 500-year anniversary. In this case, it was, I believe, every 4 years they were holding this marathon of people from Tierra del Fuego to Nunavut in Canada, um, essentially as a form of resistance, because during the 500-year anniversary of Columbus's landing in the Americas, there was a big to-do made of it in the United States. They made this big replica of the ships, and that did not go over well with indigenous people who were not fond of how it was being glorified. So the conversations are definitely happening. This movement is very much so connected to groups in the Caribbean. It's not always the same, and there's definitely differences across the islands and the dispute as to how certain Dino words are spelled or pronounced. But it's also like it's a very much so, especially now in the internet age where this kind of communication can happen instantaneously. It's very much so happening in conversation with one another.
Thank you. All right. Okay. And is there not? Oh, okay. We have Stephanie, please. Yes.
Hi, I have a question for Dr. Jackie Renhev. I was wondering, and the study she did on the women, were they aware that they needed mentorship, and did they notice fellow students having that, and they were missing out on that opportunity?
Yes, all 24 students were aware, or PhDs now, were aware that they did need mentorship, but 6 of them could not find a mentor. They didn't have anyone that they felt safe with at their universities. Some universities offered their directors of the program or advisors as mentors, but that didn't work out. They were in an advisor role, so there was a difference. And then they just couldn't find someone, or else their advisor they did have, which was also a mentor, that could be possible as well, ended up leaving the university. So many times they'll start with them, but throughout their PhD trajectory, they end up leaving for some reason or another. Thank you. Great question.
Thank you.
Other questions for the presenters? And as folks may be thinking about their question, I have a question, and this could be answered by any of the presenters. What did you find surprising, if you found anything surprising about your work? Anything come up that was in particular like, huh, that was really interesting. I didn't expect that. So yeah, please feel free, any of the presenters to share.
I'll speak on behalf of that. I know for mine, there was 3 women in the study that were mothers. They had babies during their PhD, and one of them would breastfeed in the back of the classroom. The other two, it wasn't as welcoming. But that was a big surprise. I think things are changing. That isn't something that is being heard of. And that was one of the results, is the power of motherhood.
Thank you, Jackie.
For me, in my case, I could share that since this is really my first big research project, I forgot how interconnected most stories within Latino America are. So to explore something from Puerto Rico, for example, means to explore something from Cuba, and it means to create that bridge and keep that bridge going of communication, really.
Thank you, Irene.
I can share about mine. So I think the most surprising thing for me is the amount or the struggle that I saw amongst the men when I would walk around handing out flyers. A lot of the individuals would tell me that they want support, but they feel that there's not enough support for men's mental health or for men that have experienced trauma. At least I've noticed that in my community and amongst the research that I'm doing. So that's definitely a motivating factor to do the work that I'm doing, not just with trauma, but try to focus on how we can improve support services for men that have experienced trauma or men that are struggling with their mental health. So that was something that I found interesting with my study.
Thank you, Elaine. Do any of the rest of the presenters, if you don't have anything for that question, I do have another question for y'all. What was there anything that was in particular challenging in doing the work? I know sometimes with my research, for example, and you know, trying to think about how can I think creatively and how can I find ways to include Afro-Latinos in my research? So how am I collecting data on race? And so sometimes I find it challenging when I'm doing quantitative work and using secondary data and existing data. And so that's just something that, we face so many challenges and limitations within our work. And I was wondering if anyone can speak to just any challenges that they have been facing or currently facing um, that they'd like to share.
Yeah, so my greatest challenge is that there really was no existing data. This was a very untouched topic. And literature review is hard to do when there's no literature really present in the academic space. It was mostly, I looked at a lot of Black historiographies of Latin America, because those are, I think, the most prominent kind of voices of the marginalized, and especially in the Caribbean, where Cuba, Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, all have very high Black populations, and that story needs to be in conversation with the Native story, and with Latin American story more broadly. But when it comes to the actual, indigenous perspectives, it's one thing looking at it in the context of like Bolivia, Peru, Mexico, but in places where the indigenous population is either very isolated or very small, it's hard to find really good data publications on that topic. And even harder when you're looking at this very very narrow field of that in the context of the U.S. So a sub-ethnic group within a diaspora that kind of happened over the last 30 some years. And I think that's kind of the important part of it, though, of research, is occasionally you have to kind of be a trailblazer, and you need to be willing to make that risk and kind of just craft your own theories and make it thematic rather than, kind of topical in this case, try to draw on theories of other, sociologists, like Satoto Roth, Edward Said. One of our, I didn't have the chance to mention her, but I plan on talking about one of our speakers from last year's representation of Afro-Trinidad conference, Tania Hernandez, and her talk on Mestizaje and kind of the dangers of that and how that can really lead to cultural erasure. So that was my, kind of part publication review. I didn't really have like exact stuff to work with, but especially with these sorts of topics, within ethnic studies, you really have to be the trailblazer sometimes, and it's intimidating, but you got to do it. That's what research is all about.
Thank you, Christopher. Courtney.
Yeah, I think when you mentioned some major challenges, I know something that our team has been still working with is as we're collecting like comprehensive measures of violence exposure, it often can be difficult to find measures that have already been validated in Spanish. And then when they are validated in Spanish, usually it is in Spain itself and not within Latin America, or even more specifically among like Mexican adolescents and emerging adults. So I think first just finding validated measures already in Spanish is difficult. Then finding them within the Latin American context is more difficult. And then sometimes they are there, but then they're like behind paywalls that maybe Pitt's library doesn't have access to, or something like that. So I know the undergrads have been really helpful in emailing authors of different measures and trying to just get those sent directly to us. So yeah, I think that's definitely a struggle that I'm sure lots of researchers that work with Spanish speaking populations could relate to.
Thank you, Courtney. And yes, definitely relatable. And I think in terms of, how do we make our measures racially, culturally responsive? How do we make it so folks are included? And that includes language, right? And so there's so many multiple dimensions of that. So thank you. Any other folks, either the presenters have anything else to share around limitations or challenges? And if not, anyone else in the have any questions for the presenters?
How do I raise my hand?
Oh, you're all set, Cesar. You can
Oh,
go
okay.
ahead.
Oh, okay. Cool. Well, first of all, thank you. I've been enjoying this so much, and this is more of I'm wondering about Christopher's opinion on this, because I was so fascinated. First of all, Christopher, superb exposition, superb. I personally enjoy it very much. And when you were mentioning about it's clearly right, the paradox between the part of the the religiousness, right? And you're absolutely true, right? The religiousness is in the way that it's been completely, like as we say in Latin America, they came with two things, right? The sword in one hand and the cross in the other. In the sense that for sure, like in this particular, the Catholic, strain was an integral part of it. It was not an ad hoc element of colonial, system. It was an integral element and a pillar. And I'm just wondering what would be, for example, some of the new currents within even the Catholic Church and other, Abrahamic religions and Christianity that came within the 60s, the 70s, and 80s in terms of theology of liberation, right? A theology of liberation in some places in Latin America took even a very radical perspective, right, of being, in the armed struggle of some of the people. Nicaragua, in my particular case, is the one that I'm related to. A lot of priests and seminar left and pick up the arms and went to fight. That is an extreme position. I do understand it's a more radical one. But I am wondering, like, in the sense that, theology of liberation conceives a little bit, this figure of Christ, of a very popular type of Christ that is almost a revolutionary martyr in terms of, like, victim of Roman Empire, right? And of course, in some revolutionary processes and currents in Latin America, will consider, I think, that there's some truth to that. Some scholar will understand the United States imperialism kind of like as a little bit of the successor of the Roman Empire in its bigger sense, as like the big hegemon in terms of Western culture. And I'm wondering, in the sense, and it's just really more like picking your brain more than a question, is I'm wondering what would be, or if you know anything, kind of like this particular brand of theology of liberation that is very in tune with the social struggles, and I think that they will be very much in one of them with this indigenous community. How will they interpret this one, even if you think that this will be still like a paradox, or like we gotta get rid of all of this vestige of European religious. And I understand that more like idea that I come in my mind. So more of picking your brain is Christopher than a question. But thank you so much.
Yeah, Absolutely. I didn't look really into liberation theology in particular, but I will go into more depth on sort of how the figure of Christ has been likened in indigenous communities more broadly. Now, for one, it's worth mentioning most North American, and these are now, bear in mind, these are usually Protestant communities. Most North American indigenous communities, a lot of them are what they call Native American churches, which are syncretic. So it's a combination of Native and Christian belief systems. Some are purely Christian, others purely Native. You have obviously other religions. There are Jewish Native Americans, there are 80s Native Americans. But in this case, the figure of Christ is seen as an embodiment of values that are beyond the scope of Christ. And obviously, true Christianity is not an ethnic religion. Its adherents come from all over the world. And Catholicism in particular is interesting because Catholicism has turned into a brown person's religion. We think of Catholicism now as being Latinos and Filipinos, not Irish and Italians. And it's taken a different role in the kind of the American perception. And it always sort of has had that role as being kind of a marginalized group. But when it comes to Christ as a figure in in these Native American groups, like I said, goodness of the land, equity, kind of this universal kindness, this very, I almost want to say, orthodox fundamental view of Christ, the person, the figure, not the Bible or the saints or the conquistadors or the conquest, but of this very, very pure old view. And this is once again going to the African perspective. In Le Candomblé, you would have Oshala, the god of the sky, portrayed as Jesus Christ. They sell statues of Oshala that are of white Jesus, actually, and it's this likening, it's this kind of universal, these universal truths that they can perceive within Christianity, and a lot of the Native American priests who are part of the Native American churches are very hyper aware of the paradox, and they practice Christianity not as the white man's religion, but as a way to celebrate values that they really, really are believing in. And it's different with the Tainos because a lot of it is more black and white in a lot of ways, where it's Catholicism wasn't always quite. They really cracked down in syncretism. The Spanish did for 200 years, beginning in the 17th century. But to this day, a lot of people who engage in Taino spirituality either definitely were baptized Catholic or still have Catholic beliefs and rituals in their daily lives. Because I think also in this day and age, we kind of realize that Hispanic Catholicism is very rich. It's very ritualistic. It's not just belief based. And whether you are, in your identification, you think of yourself as an atheist or a Protestant, or believing in indigenous spiritual traditions, if you were raised Hispanic Catholic, those traditions are always going to stay with you in some way or shape or form. It's sort of that it's going to be instilled within you. And at one point, I remember I filled out a survey about religion, and it kind of asked like, what religion were you kind of born with? And Hispanic Catholic was an option, not just Catholic. Hispanic Catholic was an option, and it's really something different. And the way it's perceived, like I said, is different, and the way it embodies itself within indigenous people is very different. And I've noticed that there isn't quite the same extent of syncretism within indigenous Latino communities, officially at least. Whereas you might not know it, but they are engaging in a great, great deal of indigenous traditions, from worldview, cyclical nature of time, to holidays. In the Taino tradition, we practice Dia de los Ancestros, which is Day of the Dead, essentially, for the Caribbean. And that is very much so based on the Taino ideas of ancestor worship in the underworld, not on the Catholicism, the Catholic belief of heaven and God. So it's oftentimes there, and they just won't notice it as well. So it's complicated. It's a complicated relationship, and I could go on about religion and the role it plays, but it's certainly not easy to dissect because there's a lot to it, and it's different with North America versus Latin America, different amongst Latin American countries, individuals, communities. But yeah, I'd say that there's certainly an awareness, and there's a kind of interpretation of let's use Christ as this figure of liberation and of goodness of the land and of our values because we can see him that way.
Thank you so much, Christopher. Again, superb exposition. I really enjoyed it. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, everyone.